I've lived in the Midwest for most of my life. This persistence of location only being momentarily broken by a 2-year experience in a more westward state of no importance to the story that I must tell. I only mention it because if I had lived in Missouri for an unbroken time, I think I would have been fully susceptible to the preternatural force from whom I had escaped last night. I'll try my best to recount what had happened, and hopefully you'll heed my warning and never venture to this terrible space of the United States. Last night around 6 p.m., I had made the decision to go for a walk. It's nearing the end of May and nighttime doesn't really begin until the closing minutes of 7 p.m., so I had a decent amount of time to venture without need of unnatural illumination. The neighborhood in which I live is a somewhat large, upper-middle suburban area, a subdivision divided into several smaller pockets of housing across a large expanse of hilly, intermittently forested land. And these little islands of nature are composed of densely packed trees and low foliage, and the dens of whatever animals are brave enough to still linger among the encroaching civilization. My walk led me to one such area, the closest to my house, and through which I've often ventured during early mornings when the light filters beautifully through the treetops. I haven't been through there at night before, and figured I would see what the inverse experience was like. It was and will most likely remain to be the worst decision of my life. A man-paved path led through this and the other natural aisles, connecting them with the neighborhoods around them. The nearest to my home happened to be the largest, and it acted as a rough center to this nexus of civilization and nature. My walk led me to the base of this small wood, and the darkness therein was deep. Despite the still present sun overhead, I couldn't see much beyond the path before and behind me, and the branches avenues that led to the other collections of housing all terminated in the shadows around me. I wasn't initially disturbed by the darkness, nor had I been dissuaded by it from continuing on, but something about the nature of darkness had felt unusual. I don't mean that it felt sinister or alive, or that it hid some terrible thing, but that an element of it didn't seem natural. Darkness can be described as the absence of light, a simple definition that needs no greater elaboration, assuming you understand what light is and isn't. Down there in that darkened micro valley where the path converged, darkness didn't feel like the absence of light, but a distortion of it. I, standing there amidst the trees and bush, still felt illuminated, still felt some sort of radiance fall upon my body. I wouldn't say that I had felt I was being observed by something. Again, the darkness wasn't a shade that concealed an evil. It was more like a spectral emission analogous to light, in some weird, otherworldly way. I continued on my track, my desire for an evening walk still very much alive, and eventually descended to the spot where I sat during mornings, to appreciatively gaze around as the rising sun's light did its slow, kaleidoscopic wash across the environment. It was here that I had encountered the horror that compelled me to tell this story, and hopefully discourage you all from ever setting foot in the Midwest, or at least Missouri. Across from the rock on which I sat, another small clumping of rocks mirrored my own, and on them sat a figure. I couldn't make out a single discernible thing about his appearance, and came to realize that he was entirely black. I don't mean racially, but skin, clothing, eyes, hair, everything about him had been black, as if colored in, totally. I could tell that it was a he, and even now, away from that place, I sometimes doubt myself, perhaps for the sake of my own sanity, because its body was similar to my own. Height, form, even the way that he turned his head to observe the trees, all uncomfortably similar to my own proportions and mannerisms. Behind him, for the first time since entering, I noticed that his background was not consistent with my own. Where mine carried the mixed hues of purple and orange, betokening the arriving sunset, his held that same disquieting darkness, magnified to astral degrees as the sky behind him opened to display it tenfold. His immediate backdrop too imparted that singular sense of weird inversion of light, where the darkness seemed not to be darkness as we know it, but as the light of another bizarre world. When my eyes returned to the figure, he had arisen from his seat and had started walking towards me. And at that moment, I fled, terror-stricken and senseless, because I had immediately sensed what he had intended to do. Often during my rest there, I came across some cute woodland creature, and I guess due to my passive, non-intimidating nature, they never fled from me, and even allowed me to pet them or feed them the small berries that littered the ground. For him, I sat where such an animal would, when mirrored, and in his hand was a small object, black as the fingers that had held it, and it was pulsating. I spent the rest of the night and most of the morning searching online for similar occurrences and have since found only 3 comparable incidents. The same weird, almost antipodal darkness, and a figure who resembles the observer. I have contacted the people behind those stories, and they have all confirmed that their stories took place within the Midwest, with one being in Kansas and the other 2 in Missouri. The only difference between my story and theirs being that the circumstances of their interactions were much more frightening, and in the case of the Kansas story, the witness had even heard some obscene, irreproducible sounds from his darkness-subsumed doppelganger. Each one told me that they had never left the Midwest, and I believed I was spared their greater horrors because I have. Please, do not come here. When people tell you that the Midwest is boring, you don't have to believe them, but heed the spirits of dissuasion. There's a neighborhood meeting coming up in a few weeks, and one of the topics to discuss will be the further expansion of neighborhood facilities. I've never actually attended one of these meetings, but you can bet that I'll be there, campaigning for a pool or a playground, or whatever structure can get that space near my house uprooted and concreted. I've searched for the proper place to post this. Hopefully here, where there seem to have experienced similarly terrifying and inexplicable things, will my story find a home. If anyone can help or has any information regarding these things, please message me or comment. I live in Missouri. I've tried Googling similar incidents and have come across a few, even one here, but no answer on how to stop them. I've adopted the title of the tagged post in hopes that our stories are somehow related. I'm 24 years old and until yesterday, I hadn't believed in the paranormal. Last night, I stayed at my friend's house playing MTG, watching Star Trek, and eating spicy boneless chicken wings. It's my weekend, as in 2 consecutive days off, yesterday being the first. My friend is simply unemployed, and he invited me over to have the brand of fun that 2 antisocial, sci-fi, and fantasy-obsessed people are inclined to have. At some point in the night, alcohol had been introduced, and the fun was given an added layer of juvenile delight as the cheap whiskey mixed with the wings in our bellies and resulted in almost lethal explosions of gas. Farting, throwing cards at each other like bladed discs, and emulating P-card with not-so-bad vocal mimicry. 2 guys enjoying life as they could. At some point around 2 a.m., my friend suggested that we go outside and relax, let the wind and cool air sober us up a bit so we could play video games later. I agreed and we headed out to his back patio, where 2 metal chairs with comfy padding sat facing away from the house, towards a steep hill that terminated into a dense wood. Only the initial face of tree line was visible, the interior of the small forest virtually blacked out by the impenetrable darkness. As we sat, we spoke of unsubstantial things, often having to repeat ourselves due to our shared inebriation. Something about the tightly packed wood kept drawing my eye to it, and while my friend seemed totally oblivious to this nature allure, I grew increasingly distracted by it, to the point where my friend thought that I had blacked out. He nudged my shoulder with a beer bottle, and my captivation by the forest was temporarily broken by my annoyance at him. He suggested that we come out here to sober up, but beneath his chair, I saw a 6-pack of beer, 2 slots of which were already empty. "Bro, you good?" he slurred. His eyes narrowed, presumably due to me being a shifty, if not altogether immaterial form in his very drunk sight. I responded that I was, and without seeming not good, turned his attention to the woods and asked if he saw anything weird about them. He looked and he didn't speak for a while, and then with a great huff and heave, he launched the bottle into the woods. I'm not exactly the most ecologically concerned citizen, but for some reason, I felt that this was wrong, that he had done something almost profane. I waited for the tink of the bottle smashing into a tree, or the thud of it hitting the ground somewhere, but neither happened. There wasn't a sound that followed the bottle's descent, and my friend isn't some great athlete, so the distance it traveled couldn't have been out of earshot. Again, my friend didn't notice the weirdness about this, and began cracking open another not-so-cold one. To calm my unease, I gestured towards him, and he supplied me with one as well. When we continued to drink, all thoughts of returning inside erased by the calming swill. About 10 minutes later, we ran out of beer. Bored and probably dangerously intoxicated, we decided to enter the dark woods downhill. I don't remember who suggested this, and it doesn't really matter. It happened and I have to live with it. Beerless and fearless, we scrambled down the hill. I'm honestly surprised we didn't break our necks then, and we pushed through the tall foliage. Once past the initial tree line, I felt immediately sober, and this sobering set off a series of instinctual, primitive alarms in the recesses of my mind. A perception of something other than us, the anticipation of its arrival. It had cleared my mind, drained my brain of the intoxicant, and that terrified me. I looked to my friend, whose head lolled around as he tried to reconcile his footing. It was apparent that he had not been affected as I had. I wouldn't call myself a sensitive person, sensitive in the sense that practitioners of the paranormal use the word, a usage more akin to susceptible to events and phenomena of that nature. So I'm not sure exactly why I was instilled with the sudden clarity of thought and apprehension of environment. Undeterred, my friend continued on, stumbling and pitching bodily, forcing me to shadow him so as to prevent his broken neck, should he fall down some unseen pit. For what felt like an hour, we walked in this way, until we came across what I can now still only term a blackish wall. It spanned an immeasurable distance left to right, and allowed for very limited visibility through it. This partial translucency was almost membranous, and we could see more woods behind it, but the veil that separated that portion from ours seemed to almost vibrate, as if some current within surged through. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at the shivering wall, but eventually my friend blurted, "Alright, let's check it out." Before I could express how utterly insane such a course action would be, my friend was struck in the head by a small black object. He fell back and he landed hard on his butt, and rather than cry out in surprise or pain, he let loose a grumbling burp, followed by a fiendish cackle. I couldn't believe how such a thing could be whimsical to him, but he laughed uncontrollably, and only after being shaken out of his fit did he finally settle down and acknowledge the violence that had occurred. We looked for the object and we found it a few yards away, and I don't think either of us in our disparate states of consciousness really recognized it at first. It was only until I picked it up and held it in the moonlight that it became recognizable, and I dropped it as soon as this recognition set in. It was a beer bottle, in shape at least, but the whole thing was entirely black. The label and glass the same color. No visible distinction between the two very different materials. This finally unnerved my friend enough to instill some level of sobriety in him, and to my relief, he muttered, "Let's get out of here." I happily agreed, and we turned away from the strange wall and the Stygian bottle, chalking both up to the alcohol, even though I felt perfectly sober. As we climbed that hill and we went back into his backyard, I felt a strange imitation of darkness, like a suddenly arrived overcast that had shadowed me, but not the ground on which I walked. I looked up, saw nothing, and I turned around, and I'm sure I looked like some wild animal as I scrambled up that hill on all fours, practically barking at my friend to follow me back into his house. While on that hill, when I had turned, I saw two figures exiting the tree line. One staggered about, listing haphazardly. His companion strode soberly and appeared to be on edge. Both, despite the illuminating moonlight, were impossibly black, from flesh to clothing. This alone would have made any man ascend the hill the way I did. But what propelled me up that slope with almost inhuman speed was their familiar gait. The sober one strode just as my friend did when not drunk off his ass, and the other one stumbled in my signature drunken way, taking steps too far apart in silly attempts to steady myself. I don't know if they have climbed the hill, what they want, or what they really are. My friend has finally fallen asleep on his bed, 2 hours after we had re-entered the house and barricaded all the entrances. He had the alcohol to assist him in sleep. My unnaturally earned sobriety did not allow me that privilege. The sounds of beer bottles colliding with the walls of the house and the deep, distorted laughter of their throwers had ensured that I won't sleep anytime soon. The crashes have gone on for an hour now, hundreds of tinks and clings, and I don't foresee them stopping anytime soon. The sun should have made an appearance by now, but it's like the night is cycled, and the darkness outside is growing thicker. At this point, I think I would rather be asleep when it reaches total blackness. I don't want to be conscious to see whatever comes along with it. I'm stuck here between this massive, pulsating black sphere and my doppelganger of equal blackness, who wanders through the building behind me. The observation tent is which I've hidden myself is stocked with provisions, battery-operated communication devices, and strange ornaments of some kind. They do not appear to be functional. The computer that I'm currently using has access to both the internet and a local network, and this site was the only tab in the already open browser. At first, I assumed its previous user had been doing some recreational browsing, but after reading what they had accessed here, I see that they had been studying something. A pattern of incidents seemingly related to the events unfolding around me. I feel safe for now, but something tells me that my circumstances will change soon. So, I'll tell my story and add it here to this apparent archive of horror. I live in Kansas, in a deeply rural community about 30 miles from the nearest major city. My home rests in a clearing enclosed by scattered placements of thick, towering bur oak and cottonwood trees, which span in all directions for miles, making up a humble forest. About 6 miles south of my home begins a trail, which leads through the woods and eventually ends at an easily traversable river. Across this river and past a crumbling, long-abandoned farmstead lies a manhole, unmarked by any notation of purpose or signage. During one of my day walks, I stumbled upon this manhole, and with nothing better to do on a Monday afternoon, I decided to do a bit of subterranean exploration. I entered, followed a straight yet gradually sloping tunnel, and about 2 miles later emerged above ground before a sprawling brick compound. Moss-covered, weathered, and ugly, the building was nature-claimed and in a state of total disarray, at least on the outside. A parking lot lay in front, with enough spaces for 12 cars, and branching from this was a drive-through that curled around the right side of the building, meeting a sort of intake bay. The front door double doors, lichened and blocked by heavy debris from what seemed to be a collapsed archway, was impassable, and so I decided to investigate the side door from the drive-through entrance. Through this accessible entrance was a small vestibule, still lit by a single dome light on the ceiling. A terminal sat against the wall, facing towards the outside, and a signing sheet, handheld device of some kind, and a cracked, featureless coffee mug were the only items atop it. No signatures had been made on the sheet for 3 days, and the last signing was done by a man named Austin Kurtz. The previous names are indecipherable, as the ink seemed to have been purposely smudged. I pressed on, somewhat allured by the mysterious and slightly foreboding atmosphere of the derelict facility. Past the vestibule, which held nothing of interest besides the terminal, a featureless corridor extended for several paces and led into a sort of reception area. Chairs, papers, and cardboard boxes were upturned, strewn and flattened about the area respectively. There weren't any signs of a fight or actual violence that I could see. No blood, nor indications of damage beyond the aforementioned mess. A computer sat on a receptionist desk, but the tower had been taken, leaving only the unplugged monitor. Growing uneasy, I left the room and I followed another corridor which eventually led to a sort of cargo staging area. Along the left and right walls were machines which I could only guess were used for moving large containers, and directly ahead of me was one such container. It had thick metal seals that latched shut its lid, and its proportions were similar to that of a dumpster. Across its face was displayed EAM shipment container in large yellow letters. Every other aspect of the box was stark black. A vague fear overcame me, and I continued past the box and into the next room. Through the door was another reception area like the one through which I had previously traveled, though smaller, and with thousands of small bulbs affixed to each of its walls. The floor was a thick, completely transparent glass, and beneath it were more of the bulbs. A metal desk, dented inward in its center, was the only object. Directly ahead, through a sort of vacuum-sealed portal that appeared to be an inoperable decontamination area, was the back of the facility. A fenced-in outside lot held nothing but the aforementioned sphere, and the observation tent in which I presently sealed myself. I stepped through the threshold and I approached the sphere, after noting the tent to my right. It was a totally black orb that pulsated silently, and was about double the size of a construction wrecking ball. There was no visible apparatus which could have held this thing in the air, and its unnatural suspension set my nerves aflame. Another unusual aspect of the sphere was that it emitted a light, and I say it in this manner because the emission did not illuminate anything, but instead it actually darkened the space around it. Not as a shadow being cast from an object, but a darkness emitted from the object. I know this sounds crazy, but it's the best way I can describe the phenomena. A blackened brilliance, if I may be humbly literary. I retreated back inside the building, forgetting to explore the tent in my timid flight from the spear's inverted radiance. I wish I hadn't, if only to save myself the sight of that horror. I returned to the cargo loading room to find the black container open, its lid thrown back toward me. I hadn't heard anything denoting another inhabitant of the facility, and there were no signs of forced entry. Whomever had opened the box had done so through its intended means of access. This unsettled me, and I moved around to inspect the contents. I would have screamed if I had the breath in my lungs to do so. Squatting in the box, eyes as black as that spear. In fact, everything about it had been. It was a mirror image of myself. Its clothing hung slightly too loose from its body, the same as mine, due to my lack of appetite since the death of my father a month ago. Its hair was short and curly, but sable strands replaced my oak brown tufts. His hands were pressed against his cheeks, and his eyes stared at me dumbly. Despite being a perfect, if off-colored copy, I didn't get the feeling that the thing was alive. In stupidity or perhaps curiosity, compelled courage, often indistinguishable during times of imminent peril, I touched the figure. If regret had a champion, I would carry its banner perennially. The moment my finger poked its scalp, at the precise instance of contact, it yelled. A deep, bellowed exhalation that blasted my ears, sending me reeling back in auditory bewilderment. Without ceasing that awful sound, it rose and stepped through the container, as if it had no interest in the collision of physical matter. Seeing this and regaining some of my sense, I sprinted past the figure, who made no attempts to restrain me. Before I realized it to be my desired destination, I had entered the observation tent. The shouting figure did not pursue me, and with the fading of its voice, I assumed it left the cargo area through the opposite door. Seeing that tent could be sealed, I did so, and then I examined my surroundings. Aside from the things that I had mentioned at the beginning of my story, I found an old-fashioned tape recorder and a single tape within it. I've transcribed the recording into text, which I'll list here. Austin is coming in today. Clark said he's here to do routine analysis on the EAM, but I don't believe it. Austin only comes when we mess something up, which we've been doing a lot these last 2 years. The really weird thing is that it's usually my department that is doing the messing up, but things have been pretty dull this week. The EAM hasn't emitted any new rays, and no one has succumbed to its secondary effects since the whole thing with Cougs. So if Austin is here to piss on someone, it's not us. I hope he brings another shipment of suits. This extra mundane is really corrosive, and it eats through whatever we put on in minutes. We haven't been able to have a single expedition last longer than 8 minutes before that shit starts seeping in or outright eats through the material. There's an expedition scheduled for tomorrow, and I'm on the list to take point. The last expedition extracted a sample put in one of those containers. They said its line was some kind of triple reinforced metal, but I've seen the way it eats through everything. They better get their scans and dump it in some off-site hole soon before that shit gets out in here. That's pretty much it for today. Hopefully I don't make an ass out of myself tomorrow. Nico, 5/28/19, out. After listening to the tape, I turned on the monitor and I came across this website. Resolving to stay here until the voice of that thing becomes completely inaudible, I've decided to write out my experience, hopefully leaving a supplementary record to the incidents already mentioned here, which I believe to be connected to my own. To those of you who have witnessed these things, if you are still alive, I wish you the best of luck in your escape from them. My escape, I fear, will not be easy, if even possible. Goodbye and good luck. Blake.